"You're not alone tonight," Delphine Kovac said, one hand bracing the curve of her belly, as the wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through her thin waitress uniform. The man on the steps didn't look up right away. Snow had gathered on the shoulders of a cashmere coat, worth more than she'd made in 3 years. And his shoes, hand-stitched, Italian ruins sat flat in the slush like he hadn't noticed they were there. A thin white scar ran the length of his jaw, and his hands weren't shaking. That's what she couldn't get past. It was 11 degrees on the west side of Chicago, and August Falconsy's hands weren't shaking at all, because he wasn't cold the way a man gets cold. He was cold the way a house gets cold after everyone's gone. Behind him, through the fogged glass of the Bellwether kitchen, every light was burning, 40 tables. Not one customer. He'd paid for the whole place bought out, the entire night, every seat, every plate, and then he'd walked past the door and sat down on the concrete outside. He did it every year, same night, February 14th, Babs Quillen, who'd been running that kitchen for 40 years, had told Dell exactly once. 40 years I've fed this neighborhood, and I've never seen a man pay that much money to stay hungry. Nobody in the neighborhood asked why. In that part of Chicago, you learned early which questions could cost you. But Dell was 27, 6 months pregnant, 4 months widowed, and $61,000 in medical debt. She had no way on God's earth to pay, and somewhere along the way, fear had stopped being something she could afford. So she stood there in the cold with a man who owned every door on that block and wouldn't walk through a single one, and she asked herself selfless the question that mattered. What does a man run from when he can buy the whole world and still won't come in out of the snow? "Leave," he said, and his voice was so quiet the wind almost took it. "You don't know who I am." "I do," she said. "You're the man who buys a whole restaurant and won't go inside." He looked up then, and a black Escalade rolled to the curb, and a man in a wool coat stepped out and simply stood there, didn't reach for anything, didn't say a word. Dell understood everything she needed to understand. Not from a weapon, but from the way an entire city block emptied out in 6 silent seconds. Every instinct she had told her to walk back through that door and forget his face. Instead, she set a bowl of soup down on the step beside him and said the thing that would end one life and start another. "I can't step over you like I don't see you." What she didn't know, what nobody in that neighborhood knew, was what had happened on those exact steps 22 years ago, on a night just like this one. If stories about ordinary people who find the courage to open a door move you, take a second to hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that step, to the snow, and to the moment a poor waitress said 6 words to the most dangerous man in Chicago. A thin veil of steam rose from the bowl of soup into the 11-degree air and vanished almost at once, as though even warmth knew it wasn't welcome here. August didn't look down at it. He looked straight at Dell, and there was something in that gaze that made her want to take a step back, though her legs refused to obey. "I don't need it," he said. "I didn't ask whether you needed it." The wind flung a handful of loose snow between them. He didn't blink. "What do you think you're doing?" "Putting down a bowl of soup, and then what? Then I go back inside." He fell silent. She had the feeling he was weighing something far greater than a bowl of soup, and she didn't want to know what it was. Behind her came the sound of boots on snow. Not fast, not slow. The measured pace of a man who had walked that way all his life and had never needed to hurry. The man in the wool coat was approaching, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his eyes never leaving Dell, and she understood that whatever happened to her in the next 6 seconds would no longer be up to her. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She could feel the baby making one slow turn inside her belly. She could hear the snow falling. Then August raised one hand. Only 2 fingers. His wrist never left his knee. The gesture was so small that if Dell had blinked, she would have missed it. The footsteps stopped. She heard them halt just behind her left shoulder, close enough for her to smell cold tobacco cling to wool. Then the boots retreated. 1 step, 2 steps, back to the curb and no farther. The man didn't say a single word from beginning to end. No one explained to Dell what had just happened, but she knew she had just been permitted to keep living by 2 fingers belonging to a man seated on a concrete step. And she also knew that somewhere in this city, there were people who weren't given that permission. She didn't thank him. She didn't believe she could open her mouth. August lowered his hand slowly, as though what he'd just done had cost him less effort than breathing. "You should go inside," he said. This time his voice was different. It wasn't an order. It was almost something else. "So should you?" "No, the door's open," Dell said. "It's always open to people who pay, not to me." She waited. He said nothing more. There was a moment when she almost asked why, and another when she realized that if she did, he would stand up and leave, and she would never know. So she didn't ask. She pulled her sleeves down over her numb knuckles, turned her back, and went inside. The bell above the door gave a small cry. The same bell Babs had refused to replace since she first took over the place, even though it sounded like a cat whose paw had been stepped on. It was so warm inside that Dell's face began to sting. She stood behind the counter for a long while, both hands pressed against the coffee pot that had already gone cold, and she didn't turn around right away. She let herself count to 20. Then she looked back. Through the glass fogged with steam, she could see only a dark shape on the steps, and she had to wipe a circle clear with her sleeve before she could make him out. A guest had picked up the bowl of soup. He held it in both hands, his fingers curved around the sides, his elbows resting on his knees. He didn't lift it to his mouth. He didn't pick up the spoon. He simply held it, exactly the way a person holds the last warm thing left in his hands, and Dell realized, more slowly than she cared to admit, that he wasn't hungry. He had never been hungry. That man could have bought the entire diner 40 times over. And he wasn't holding the bowl because of the soup. He was holding it because it was warm, and because it was the only warm thing anyone had given him, without wanting something in return. She stood there watching until Babs shouted from the kitchen that the floor wasn't going to mop itself. Before they locked up, Dell quietly emptied the frozen broth, thoroughly washed the bowl, and set it on the shelf as a silent keepsake. Dell mopped the floor. She finished at 11 o'clock. She turned the chairs upside down at 11:20. She switched off the row of lights at 11:30, and every time she passed the window she glanced outside, and he was still there. He was still there at midnight. He was still there at 1 in the morning, when the snow changed from soft flakes to hard grains and began lashing sideways across the street. He was still there at 2. The Escalade idled for 4 hours, its red taillights glowing dimly through the snow, and the man in the wool coat didn't step outside again. By 3 in the morning, when Dell locked the door from the inside and left through the back entrance, the steps were empty. The bowl of soup was still there, placed neatly against the edge of the wall so no one would trip over it, the rims swept clean of snow as though someone had wiped it with a sleeve. Inside the bowl, the soup was still full, untouched. Frozen solid, it was 3:20 in the morning, and the building on Hoyne Street had no elevator. It never had, and it never would. 34 steps led from the front door to the 3rd floor. Dell counted them every night, not because she wanted to, but because by the 22nd step, her calves began to ache, and she needed a number to hold on to. She stopped on the 2nd floor landing, braced both hands against the railing, and waited for the sharp pain in her lower back to pass. In her coat pocket, the apartment key still carried the little plastic fish keychain Patrick had bought at a $3 souvenir shop during their trip to Wisconsin. And she still hadn't taken it off. She opened the door. The apartment was 452 square feet, with 1 bedroom and a window facing the brick wall of the building next door. She took off her shoes and sat on the edge of the bed, and when she pulled off her socks, deep rings were pressed into the skin around her ankles, and both feet had swollen so badly that her toes no longer seemed separate from one another. She filled a basin with cold water from the bathtub, set it on the floor, and lowered her feet into it. She counted to 60. Then she picked up her phone. 4 voice messages. She knew who all 4 were from before she pressed play. Arthur Pell's voice was never loud. That was the worst thing about it. The first message, at 10:10 in the morning, said that he understood this was a difficult time. He truly understood, and he only wanted to work with her toward a solution. The second, at 1 in the afternoon, reminded her that his office had already been more patient than its internal policy allowed. The third, at 4:20, reminded her of the amount, $61,400, and he read it slowly, 1 word at a time, like a man dictating to a child. The fourth, at 7 that evening, said that he had seen the file listing her expected delivery date, and he congratulated her, and then he said hoped she understood that the arrival of a child only made resolving the matter more urgent. He didn't threaten her, he didn't need to. Dell deleted all 4 messages and placed the phone face down. On the refrigerator, Beneath a magnet shaped like the state of Illinois was the letter she had read 40 times and still reread once every week, as though someone might slip into the apartment at night and quietly change it. The words never changed. Meridian Ledger Group's health insurance coverage ended on the final day of the month in which he left his job. He had 60 days to enroll in continued coverage under Cobra. He didn't enroll. On the 5th day of those 60 days, his car rolled over on Archer Road later that night. 4 days later, she was admitted to the hospital for dehydration and dangerously low blood pressure. 3 nights. 1 emergency ultrasound. 1 injection whose name the nurse had said so quickly that Dell had never looked it up afterward. The bill arrived 3 weeks later. No insurance, no guarantor. $61,400, and the only name on the paper was hers. She pulled open the closet door. Patrick's coat was still hanging there, the gray wool coat he had worn to work every day for 4 years, its elbows polished smooth from resting on his desk. She took it down. She didn't raise it to her nose. She simply held it across her lap and placed one hand over the breast pocket, where he had always kept 2 pens and had always managed to tear the lining. 3 weeks before he left his job, she had sat in this exact place and handed him a pregnancy test. He had stared at it for a long time, longer than she thought he would. Then he asked her a question she had found funny then and didn't find funny now. "Do you think a child knows where its money comes from?" She had laughed and told him that children only needed to know who was holding them. He didn't laugh. He folded the test into his palm and sat in silence for a very long time, and 3 weeks later he submitted his resignation, and he didn't explain a single word of it to her, and she stayed angry with him for 11 days because of it. She was still angry with him when he died. That was the part she never told anyone. She hung the coat back inside the closet. She didn't close the door all the way. She left it open by a narrow crack, just as she had for the past 4 months. Then she lifted her feet from the basin, dried them with an old towel, and lay down on her left side because Dr. Sommer had told her to sleep on her left side. There was a stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Texas. Outside the window, snow struck the brick wall of the neighboring building, fell into the narrow space between the 2 structures, where there was nothing at all, where no one had ever walked. Dell placed one hand on her belly and kept it there until she felt a small kick beneath her palm. "Mommy can handle it," she said. She said it to the ceiling. No one heard her. Then she closed her eyes and slept for exactly 3 hours and 10 minutes. And during those 3 hours and 10 minutes, somewhere else in the city, a man was holding a brown file folder and reading her husband's name for the first time in his life. At 6:45 in the morning, Bellwether Kitchen opened its doors, and the first thing Dell heard when she stepped across the threshold was Babs Quellen cursing the heater. Before heading inside, Dell had walked around to the front steps to retrieve the frozen bowl of soup, carrying it through the door and setting it in the kitchen sink. She wasn't cursing it mildly. She stood with both hands planted on her hips in front of the aging metal box mounted on the wall, calling it words that a woman who attended church every Sunday had no business knowing. "Is it making that noise again?" Dell asked as she removed her scarf. "It isn't making noise. It's singing. It's been singing the same song for 40 years, and I still don't know the words." Babs kicked the baseboard. The heater clattered 3 times and fell silent, then started again. "I've called 4 repairmen. The first one said replace it. The second one said replace it. The third one said replace it. The fourth gave me an estimate and disappeared, which makes him smarter than the other 3. She turned to look at Dell, and her eyes paused on Dell's feet for exactly half a second. "Sit down. I can stand. I didn't ask whether you could." "Sit." Dell sat. Babs set a plate of eggs and 2 slices of toast in front of her, though Dell hadn't ordered them, and Dell knew better than to mention that she hadn't. At 7:10, Benedict Orlowski pushed through the door, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the smell of engine oil that never left him no matter how many times he showered. He was 33, with hands as large as a bear's paws, and he had eaten breakfast here every workday since he was a young apprentice. "Morning, Dell." "Morning, Babs. Morning, heater. You're still not dead?" "It'll bury both me and you," Babs said. Benny took the counter stool beside Dell, looked at her belly, then at the plate she was eating from. "Eggs, huh? That little girl is going to come out with 2 yolks for eyes." "It is a girl," Dell said. "I know. I bet Marty at the laundromat $20. If you have a boy, I'm suing you. Go ahead. I already owe $61,000. Another 20 won't make a difference. She said it as a joke, but no one laughed, and Benny stared down into his coffee longer than necessary. How's your car? He asked. It still starts. That's not an answer. Bring it by my shop. No charge. You said that last month, and you still haven't brought it in, so I have to say it again. That's how invitations work, Dell. At 7:40, the bell over the door rang again, and Sister Maureen Flannery stepped inside, 71 years old, wearing a gray wool coat and carrying 2 empty plastic containers, just as she did every Tuesday and Friday morning. Barbara, Maureen, what do you have for me today? Beans soup from last night and a tray of bread I ruined. It isn't really ruined. It's just ugly. Those children at St. Bridget don't eat with their eyes. No, Sister Maureen said, they eat with their stomachs, just like you. She transferred the soup into the plastic containers, and before she left, she rested one hand on Dell's shoulder for a single second without saying anything, because that was her way. By 9 o'clock, the diner had gone quiet again. Dell wiped down the counter. She hadn't meant to ask. She had told herself all morning that she wouldn't. But the bowl of soup, now completely melted and cold, was still sitting in the sink, and no one had thrown it away. And she saw it every time she turned around. Babs, yeah. The man from last night. The spatula in Babs's hand stopped. It didn't fall. It didn't tremble. It simply stood for the space of one beat, and Dell noticed because she had worked in this kitchen long enough to know. Babs had never once stopped in the middle of something for any reason. He sat out there for 4 hours. He didn't eat. He only held the bowl. And don't, Babs said only one word. She didn't raise her voice. That was what silenced Dell, because when Babs didn't raise her voice, it meant the matter had gone beyond anything that could be joked about. She placed the spatula on the stove with extraordinary care. Then she turned around, and her face wasn't angry. It held something Dell had never seen there before. Don't ask that question in my kitchen. I know you were only. Everyone is only. Then they ask a second question, and a third, and by the fourth they aren't standing on the outside anymore. She picked up the spatula and turned the bread, and the crackle of grease filled the silence. You're 27 years old, about to have a baby, and you owe more money than I make in 3 years. You don't have room in your life for that. Trust me. You know him. Babs didn't answer. She didn't answer for the next 40 minutes, and she didn't say another word to Dell until almost noon, when she handed her a glass of water and told her to drink every drop. At 12:15, Dell carried the trash out through the back, and when she came inside again, she passed the kitchen doorway without Babs realizing she was there. Babs stood beside the front window. She wasn't wiping it. She wasn't cleaning. Both hands were tucked inside her apron. She was staring toward the steps, where the mark in the snow had melted into a puddle of gray water, and she stood that way for a long time, her lips moving twice without making a sound. Dell stepped backward. She didn't want Babs to know she had seen, but when she returned to the counter, she realized something that sent a chill down her spine. Babs hadn't been looking at the steps. She had been looking at the door. 3 days later, at 10:40 in the morning, no one in the diner heard a car pull up. That was the detail Dell remembered for a long time afterward. There was no black Escalade easing toward the curb, no car door slamming shut, nothing to announce his arrival. The bell over the door gave a sharp, clear ring that cut through the morning chatter, and August Falcone walked into the diner in broad daylight like any ordinary man passing by. Benny later told her he had seen the vehicle parked 2 blocks away, near the corner of Hoyne Street and Cermak Road. Its lights off, its engine dead, with the man in the wool coat still sitting inside. Rumor in the neighborhood was that old Vittorio Falcone had passed away in a federal cell years ago, leaving August to rule the block. Yet August carried himself differently. August had walked 5 blocks through the snow, so no one would have to see that car parked in front of their home. No one told Dell what that meant, but the entire diner went silent. Not the kind of silence that falls when something has happened. The kind that comes when 7 people decide at the same moment that their coffee has suddenly become very important to look at. Mr. Alvarez at table 3 folded his newspaper and didn't open it again. The 2 electricians at table 7 stopped arguing in the middle of a sentence. Even Benny, who hadn't been quiet once in 9 years, only turned his coffee cup in a slow circle and lowered his eyes. August looked at no one. He walked straight to the table in the farthest corner, the one pressed against the wall that nobody liked because it rested beside a water pipe and was always cold. And he sat down with his back to the wall and his face turned toward the door. He didn't remove his coat. Dell picked up the coffee pot and took 3 steps before Babs moved in front of her. "I'll take it, Babs, I'll take it." She snatched the pot from Dell's hand. She poured 1 cup without asking what he wanted, carried it to the corner table, and set it down harder than necessary. Coffee spilled over the rim and spread into a brown ring across the tabletop. No one in the diner turned to look. August didn't look at the coffee either. He looked at Babs. Babs looked back at him. Neither of them said a word, and it lasted long enough for Dell to count to 4, and then Babs turned away, went into the kitchen, and didn't back out until after he left. He drank the coffee black. He ordered nothing else. He sat there for exactly 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, he didn't take out his phone, didn't read anything, and didn't look at anyone. He only sat. Dell cleared 2 other tables, refilled Benny's coffee twice, and I wiped away the brown stain at table 7. And every time she turned, she felt something heavy in the corner of the room. Not because he was watching her, but because he wasn't. At 11:20, he stood up. He came to the counter. He placed money on the glass surface. Cash, folded once. Dell looked down and saw $2.75, exactly the price of 1 cup of coffee written on the chalkboard behind her, including city tax, exact to the last cent. She stared at the money longer than she meant to. "You forgot the tip," she said. She didn't know why she said it. She had lived through the past 4 days with a frothing bowl of soup in the sink and the memory of 2 fingers raised in the snow, and the words came out before she had time to consider that they might be the last ones she ever spoke. August stopped. He turned his head. Only his head without turning the rest of his body. "I don't tip. Everyone tips. I don't. Why?" He was silent for 1 beat. Then he spoke in the same even voice, without rising or falling, like a man reciting a law he had memorized long ago. "A tip is paying for kindness. People leave money behind so they'll be remembered as good for 30 seconds. Then they walk away, and they don't owe anyone anything anymore. I've paid for kindness my whole life. It always has a price, and it's always false." He looked at her. "You gave it to me. You didn't take money. I can't buy back something I've already received." He didn't smile. There was nothing in his face at all. He walked to the door, and Dell heard the bell ring, and she stood there with $2.75 on the glass counter without picking it up. Benny turned toward her from his stool. "Dell, what? Do you know who that man is?" "No." Benny studied her for a moment. Then he looked down at his coffee. "Good," he said. "Dad, keep it that way." He paid and left for work, and he tipped her $3 like he did every day, and Dell dropped it into the jar. But she set the other $2.75 apart beneath the counter, and she didn't know why. She stood there until Babs came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, and both women looked toward the empty pay corner table. "He has never come inside," Babs said. Her voice was very quiet. Ever? Not once. He stands outside and he leaves." She turned to Dell, and this time she hid nothing. "Then you gave him a bowl of soup, and now he comes inside." She started toward the kitchen. At the doorway, she stopped. "Child, I don't know what you just opened." He came back the next day. Then the day after that. By the 4th day, Alvarez had opened his newspaper again. But the 6th, the 2 electricians at table 7 were arguing as usual. And that was how a neighborhood on the west side decided that something dangerous had become something simply present. He always arrived at 10:40. He always sat at the corner table. He always ordered black coffee and always paid $2.75. And Dell always set the money aside beneath the counter. And by the end of the week, there were 7 small stacks of change lined up in a neat row, like a little fence she couldn't explain even to herself. He didn't help with anything. That was what Dell couldn't understand. She had imagined all kinds of things, but he never stood up to carry plates, never wiped a table, never asked whether anyone needed anything. He only sat and watched. By the 5th day, she understood what he was doing. He knew Mr. Alvarez sat at table 3 every day, and always folded his newspaper at the sports section. He knew Benny arrived at 7:10 and left at 7:50. He knew the second stool from the far end of the counter had a loose leg. He knew Dell shifted her weight from one foot to the other 4 times in 10 minutes whenever she stood too long. He never asked anyone a question. He simply watched, and he kept everything in his head like a man who had spent his entire life learning everything inside a room before stepping into it. On Wednesday morning, the heater clattered 3 times, then let out a long shriek like metal being torn apart. Babs struck the wall. She hit it again, and it fell silent for 4 seconds before starting all over. 40 years, she said to the ceiling. August stood up. The entire diner went quiet for the second time that week. He crossed the counter, walked around behind it, and no one tried to stop him because no one knew what they were supposed to do. For the first time in 7 days, he removed his coat and draped it over the back of a chair. He knelt in front of the heater, and he didn't ask for tools. He simply loosened the front panel with his fingers, turned it, and set it on the floor without making a sound. He looked inside for exactly 10 seconds. Then he reached in with his bare hand and did something Dell couldn't see from where she stood, except that one shoulder moved once, very slowly. Metal slid against metal. The heater went silent, completely silent. Then it began to run smoothly, giving off an even hum no one in the diner had ever heard before. He replaced the panel. He stood. His fingertips were black with grease, and there was a red line across the knuckle of his index finger where the metal had cut him. He didn't look at it. The counterweight valve was out of alignment, he said. No one pushed it back into place for 40 years. 4 repairmen told me it had to be replaced, Babs said. Because replacing it gets them paid. She looked at him. He looked back. Then she picked up a clean towel and tossed it to him, and he caught it with one hand. Wipe your hands, she said. He did. She took a tray with a cup of coffee and a plate of toast and set it on the counter in front of him instead of carrying it to his table. You forgot, Dell, began. I didn't forget. Babs wiped her hands on her apron. No one in here serves anyone for free. Not even you. Especially you. August looked at the tray. Then he looked at her. And Dell saw something very small happen in his face, something she didn't have a name for. He picked up the tray with both hands, carried it to his corner table, sat down, and ate. For the first time in 7 days, he ate. That afternoon, the snow melted and froze again into a thin sheet of ice across the steps. Dell took the trash out at 12:20. She stepped onto the second stair. Her right foot slid and the whole world tilted, and in that 1/10 of a second she had only one thought, and it wasn't about herself. A hand closed around her elbow. It didn't grab. It didn't pull. It simply closed and held, solid as an iron hook, and stopped her halfway through the fall. She hadn't known he was there. He hadn't come through the front door. She looked up. August stood below the steps, one hand around her elbow, the other hanging at his side, and he said nothing. She said nothing. Their breath turned white in the cold and dissolved into each other. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds lasted longer than they needed to, and they both knew it, and neither of them let go first. Then he released her. He stepped back. Salt, he said. What? These steps need salt. He said it very quietly. Del's there holding the trash bin, with one place on the sleeve near her elbow still warm. The next morning, when she arrived at 6:45, the steps had been salted. All of them. From the edge of the doorway down to the end of the sidewalk, no one had seen anyone do it. The empty salt bag stood neatly against the wall, folded in half and clean, and beside it, leaning against the baseboard, was a second unopened bag of salt, saved for next time. The man walked in at 9:15 on Friday morning, and the first thing he did was hold the door open for Sister Maureen as she left carrying 2 full plastic containers. Let me take those, sister. Thank you, young man. You're carrying all this by yourself? No, that won't do. Where's your car? He carried the containers all the way to the curb, placed them carefully in her trunk, then came back inside, and he smiled. He smiled often. That was the first thing Dell noticed about him. He was August's younger brother, wearing a pale gray coat and an open scarf, and he had the kind of smile people wanted to trust immediately. In his hands was a bouquet of flowers, white tulips, in the middle of February in Chicago. Miss Barbara Quillen, he said, speaking her name as though he were greeting an old friend. 40 years. 40 years of cooking for an entire neighborhood without closing for a single day. I only wanted to tell you that I know. People rarely say these things aloud. He placed the bouquet on the counter. Babs didn't touch it. Who told you? The whole neighborhood says it. You just don't stand outside long enough to hear, he smiled. She didn't. He didn't appear to notice. He turned and looked around, and he looked around the way a man reads, rather than the way a man simply sees. He glanced briefly toward the clean, empty soup bowl on the shelf, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before he recovered. Mr. Alvarez, he said, nodding toward table 3. Table 3, the Chicago Sun-Times, 2 slices of toast. Am I right? Mr. Alvarez blinked. You're right. I've stopped in a few times before. You just didn't notice me then. He smiled. He sat on a stool at the counter, not at the corner table, and ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie. And then he asked Dell her name. Delphine. Delphine, that's beautiful. What do people call you? Dell. No, Delphine is better. He finished the entire slice of apple pie and praised it 3 times, choosing a different detail each time. And by the 3rd compliment, Dell realized he had truly tasted it, rather than merely saying something pleasant. He asked Babs about the heater. It's quiet now, Babs said. It made noise for 40 years, and now it's quiet. Strange, isn't it? He didn't ask why. That was the moment a chill began crawling down Dell's spine, though she didn't understand why, because that was exactly where an ordinary person would ask why. Then he turned toward her. He didn't look at her face first. He looked down, and his eyes settled on her belly for exactly 1.5 seconds, no longer and no shorter. And then he raised his gaze and gave her a warm smile. Congratulations, thank you. How far along are you? 6 months, 6 months. He nodded slowly, as though the number meant something to him. A child about to enter the world is the most sacred thing there is. People tend to forget that. They worry about money, housing, and 100 other things, and only when the baby is born do they remember that some things aren't meant to be touched by anyone. He finished the last sip of his coffee. Do you have Fanta? No one at all? No. Then you're much stronger than I thought, he said, and he smiled, and the word sounded like a compliment. Yet Dell stood there with both hands gone cold and didn't know why. He took out his wallet. He placed 2 $100 bills on the counter. The coffee and apple pie cost her $4.50. You gave me the wrong amount, Dell said. No mistake. This is $200. You stand all day with 6 months growing inside you. If $200 is a mistake, then this entire city is mistaken. He tapped the counter twice with one finger, lightly. Take it, Delphine. Accept something that doesn't make you owe anyone. He put on his coat. At the door he turned back. Miss Quillen, yes, white tulips are difficult to find this month. I had to order them from Michigan, he smiled. Put them in water right away, or they'll go to waste. The bell over the door cried out. He left. No one said anything for 10 seconds. Then Babs stepped out from behind the counter. She picked up the bouquet of white tulips with both hands, didn't remove the wrapping, and walked straight through the kitchen to the back door. And Dell heard the lid of the trash can open, followed by the sound of the flowers falling to the bottom of the empty metal bin. The lid closed. Babs came back inside and washed her hands in the sink twice, using soap all the way up to her wrists. Babs, don't, he only brought flowers. She turned off the faucet. She stood staring into the clean sink, her mind drifting back to the cold night when a simple gesture had altered the alignment of her world. Child, she said, when a man knows your name and you've never told it to him, he didn't come here for apple pie. She picked up the 2 $100 bills from the counter, folded them into quarters, and placed them inside the bottom drawer, the one no one ever opened. Don't spend that money, she said. Why? Because one day you may need to give it back. The storm arrived on Tuesday evening, and by 7 o'clock the city had shut down. The Department of Transportation advised everyone to stay off the roads. Babs put up the closed sign 2 hours early, and Dell couldn't get home because the number 9 bus had stopped running. So the 2 women remained inside a locked diner with a heater that, for the first time in 40 years, was running in perfect silence. Babs pulled a bottle of brandy from the cabinet beneath the sink. It was still 2/3 full, with dust settled across its shoulders. You drink? Once a year, she poured herself 1 finger. She didn't pour any for Dell. Instead, she pushed a glass of warm milk toward her. And Dell understood that Babs had been planning this ever since she hung the sign. Babs took her first sip. She looked out the window, where snow whipped sideways through the yellow glow of the streetlights. And without looking at Dell, she said, 22 years ago, the night looked just like this. Dell said nothing. She had learned the week before that speaking at a moment like this only ruined it. Her name was Giovanna. She was 44, Italian, born in Melrose Park, sang in the choir at St. Brigid for 19 years. Maureen remembers her voice better than her face. Babs turned the glass slowly in her hand. She had a son, 15 years old. Dell set down her milk. Her husband was Vittorio Falcone. You don't need to know what he did. You only need to know that when she was 38, he brought another woman into their home. He didn't divorce Giovanna. He didn't leave. He moved the other woman onto the 2nd floor and left Giovanna on the 3rd, then told her she was still his wife before God, so she had nothing to complain about. Babs took a second sip. 6 years. She lived that way for 6 years. The other woman gave him a son, and Giovanna had to listen to that baby cry through the floor every night. The heater hummed steadily. Outside, the sheet shifted and snow struck the glass in a sudden burst. Then, in February of that year, she developed chest pain. She went to Mercy Hospital. They kept her for 3 hours and sent her home. They sent her home? They sent her home. Babs set down the glass very gently. Vittorio had a case. His lawyer demanded money up front, so he emptied everything. The accounts, the funds, and the Finaglia health insurance policy he had paid into for 17 years. He drained it all in a single afternoon to pay a man sitting at a desk 8 miles away from her. Dell could hear herself breathing. She looked down at the glass of milk. She thought of the Illinois-shaped magnet on her refrigerator and the paper beneath it, and she thought of the sentence saying the group insurance coverage on the final and she said nothing, and she didn't need to, because Babs wasn't looking at her, but Babs knew. She had no cash, no card. She walked from Mercy 3 miles, through the snow. 44 years old, chest pain, church shoes. Babs picked up the bottle and poured more. Her hand was steady, but the bottle touched the rim of the glass with a faint click. She didn't go straight home. She couldn't go back to that house anymore, do you understand? So she came around this neighborhood instead. She drank. She knocked on 4 doors. Dell stopped breathing. The Kowalski house at the corner of Hoyne Street. The Petrelli house. Mr. Dombrowski's laundromat, with the lights still on inside. And one more I won't name. No one opened? No one opened. It was below 0. Everyone knew who she was, Babs said. That was the problem. Everyone knew whose wife she was. Opening the door for Vittorio Falcone's wife at 11 o'clock at night meant stepping into the middle of something no one wanted to stand between. People looked through their curtains. They saw her. Then they turned off the lights. She set down the glass. Mr. Dombrowski turned off the lights in the laundromat. I know because I walked past that night, and I remember seeing them on and then suddenly seeing them go dark. Dell felt the baby make one slow turn beneath her palm. No one shot her, Babs said. No one laid a finger on her. The newspaper said cardiac arrest caused by hypothermia. One line on page 14 beside a classified ad for a used car. She raised her eyes and looked directly at Dell for the first time. Fear killed her, not a gun. That thing doesn't need a gun. It only needs an entire street to decide at the same moment that what is happening isn't their concern. Outside, the storm let out one long howl and then fell quiet. Dell asked the question whose answer she had known from the moment Babs said 22 years. Where did she fall? Babs didn't answer with words. She turned her head very slowly and looked toward the front door, through the fogged glass, down at the 3 concrete steps lying white beneath the yellow light. She stared at that place for a long time. Then she said, her voice dry as paper, exactly 3 steps from an open door. Dell opened her mouth to ask who had found her, and Babs answered before the question had fully taken shape. The 4th door was this one. The heater hummed steadily. Nothing else in the diner made a sound. I was cooking the stove. 11:20 at night. The kitchen light was on, but I had already turned off the lights out front and hung the sign. Then I heard the knocking. She didn't look at Dell. She looked at her own hands resting on the counter. 3 knocks. Not loud. Not the kind of knock made by someone who expects to be let in. The kind made by someone who has already knocked 3 times at 3 other places. She turned the empty glass halfway around. I walked out to the middle of the room. I stood exactly where you're standing now. And I looked outside. You saw her. I saw her. Dell could hear the clock on the wall. In 2 years of working there, she had never heard it before. I knew who she was. Everyone in this neighborhood knew Giovanna's face. She bought bread here every Saturday. Babs drew a breath, and I thought it, that exact thought. I remember every word of it after 22 years. If I open this door, who will be standing outside mine tomorrow? She laid both hands flat on the counter, palms turned upward as though they were objects she was seeing for the first time. I was 46. I had just made the final payment on the loan for this place. My husband had been dead for 2 years. I had no children. All I had were these 4 walls that I had spent half my life working in and a heater that screamed like the devil. And I stood there and I calculated. I calculated, Dell, the way you calculate the cost of groceries. Outside, the wind changed direction. I stepped back into the kitchen. I turned off the kitchen light. No one said anything for a long time. Then I stood in the dark and listened. There was no more knocking. I thought she must have gone. I thought she must found somewhere else. I finished cleaning the stove in the dark. Can you believe that? I finished cleaning the stove, she continued, her voice still dry. Then I opened the door, because I could still hear it, because that knocking hadn't gone anywhere. It was inside my head, and it wouldn't turn off the way the light had. She fell silent for 2 seconds. 20 minutes. From the last knock until I opened the door was 20 minutes. I know exactly because that clock has been hanging there since then, and it has never lost a minute. Dell didn't ask what Babs had seen. Babs finished the story in 4 words. She was still warm, the clock, the heater. I called the ambulance. It took 14 minutes to arrive because of the storm. They did everything they could on that sidewalk for 40 minutes. I stood there and watched. She picked up the bottle but didn't pour. She set it down again. For 40 years, I've opened this door at 6:45 every morning, and I haven't closed for a single day. I didn't close on the anniversary of my husband's death. I didn't close when I broke my wrist. I didn't close during the blizzard of 1999, when the whole city shut down. She looked at Dell. I've cooked for this neighborhood for 40 years trying to pay back 20 minutes. You do the math for me and tell me how much I still owe. Dell couldn't answer. She realized her face was wet, and she couldn't remember when it had started. She wasn't crying for the woman who I had on the steps 22 years earlier, because she had never met her. She wasn't crying for the man who sat outside every February. She was crying for the 68-year-old woman sitting 3 feet away from her, the woman who made her sit down when she had been standing, who placed eggs in front of her without asking, who had opened this door at 6:45 every morning for 40 years. Because if she stopped for even one day, those 20 minutes would return. Dell reached across the counter and placed her hand over Babs. Babs didn't pull away. She didn't hold Dell's hand either. Their hands simply rested there together. Don't say anything, Babs said. I won't. Good. People always say things. They tell me I wasn't to blame, that I couldn't have known. I don't need that. I know what I calculated during those 20 minutes, and no one can take that out of me. She withdrew her hand slowly, washed the glass, and turned it upside down. The 15-year-old boy, she said. He came the next day. He sat down on those steps and stayed there all night. I went outside and told him to come in. He didn't look at me. He only said, "No, thank you, Mom." He thanked me, Dell. 15 years old. Babs dried her hands. He came back the next year, then the year after that. In 22 years, he hasn't missed once. Then, when he was 25, a lawyer came to see me and said the building had changed ownership. I thought I was finished. I had already packed everything in my head. She hung the towel on its hook. The new owner didn't evict me. He didn't raise the rent. He hasn't raised it by a single cent in 12 years. He asked for only one thing. She looked toward the front door one final time. Every February 14th, this diner must be empty. He pays for all 40 tables. He doesn't come inside. She turned off the lights above the counter. Until the night you carried that bowl of soup outside. The storm broke at 4 o'clock in the morning, and at 10:40, August Falcone walked in as he did every day, and sat down at the corner table. Dell didn't bring him coffee. She set the pot down. She removed her apron, hung it on the hook, and walked out through the front door, and Babs saw her and didn't try to stop her, and it was the first time in 2 years that Babs had ever allowed her to do something foolish. Dell stepped outside and sat on the top step. Salt crunched beneath the soles of her shoes. She sat there alone, in broad daylight, on the 3 concrete steps whose meaning she now understood. 40 seconds later, the bell over the door cried out. He didn't ask what she was doing. He walked down 2 steps and stood on the sidewalk, with his back toward the street and his face toward the door, exactly where a man who wanted to keep the exit in sight would stand. "You should go inside. You've said that 4 times already," Dell said. Babs told me. He didn't react. Not a single feature moved. Told you what? Everything. The wind swept down the street and lifted the salt into a thin white trail. She had no right, she did. She's already paid for it with 40 years, he fell silent. Dell looked straight at him and asked the question she had carried inside her since the night of the storm. Every year, you pay for 40 tables. You don't eat. You don't come inside. So what are you paying for? He didn't answer. You pay to keep the diner empty, she said. But it isn't empty, is it? He looked at her longer than he ever had before. Babs said, "You call 3 weeks ahead every year. You don't call her. You call the reservation company. And you give them one instruction she hasn't understood in 12 years. Dell drew a breath. Table number 1, beside the window. Set for 2. The street was silent. Far away, she could hear a snowplow. Who sits in the second chair? He said nothing for a long time. Long enough for Dell to think he would turn away, and she would never know, just as she had feared in the snow that first night. Then he spoke, and his voice didn't change, and that was what tightened something inside her chest. No one, August. It is a dinner I never got to have with her. He looked past Dell's shoulder, through the window, toward table number 1 standing empty inside. She worked 6 days a week. She sang at church on Sundays. She never went out to eat. In that house, she ate alone on the 3rd floor from a tray she carried upstairs herself. He paused. I was 15, and I promised her that one day I would take her somewhere where someone would bring the food to her. She laughed. She said, hearing me say it had already made her full. When did you promise her? January, 4 weeks. Dell closed her eyes. The following week, he continued, I had nothing left to eat. He locked the downstairs kitchen. The other woman cooked for 2 people, not 3. He said it in the voice of a man reading prices from a board. I stood in line at St. Bridget, 7 o'clock in the evening every Tuesday and Friday. A young sister handed out bread. She remembered my face and never asked whose son I was. Dell thought of the 2 plastic containers and the hand that rested on her shoulder every Tuesday morning. Sister Maureen, she's still standing there, he said. 71 years old. Dell opened her eyes. Then she asked the final question, the one she had asked herself in the snow that night and no one had answered. You own this entire building. You own this whole block, don't you? He neither confirmed nor denied it. You have every door on this street. Why won't you walk through one? He looked at her. And this time, there was something in his face, not emotion, but the complete absence of it, the kind of emptiness a person achieves only after practicing for many years. Because she wasn't allowed inside, he said. Dell said nothing. She knocked 4 times. 4 doors with people behind them. All 4 could have opened. None of them did. He looked down at the 3 concrete steps. She died out here. So I sit out here. You think that makes it fair? I don't think it makes anything. I simply won't sit inside while she remains outside. He fastened 1 button on his coat. Table number 1 is the warmest place in the diner, beside the heater. Had she been allowed inside that night, that is where she would have sat. He turned away. He had taken 3 steps when Dell called after him. August, he stopped. She wouldn't want this, Dell said. He didn't turn around. He stood motionless on the sidewalk with his back to her as snow began falling again across his shoulders, and he spoke a single sentence so softly that Dell had to understand it, with her whole body rather than with her ears. I know. I still sit there. The car was parked at the corner of Hoyne Street and Cermak Road. Its engine running, its lights off, and August sat in the back seat for 17 minutes without saying a word. Thaddeus Reese sat in front with both hands resting on the steering wheel even though the car wasn't moving, because 41 years of life and 20 years beside this family had taught him that when the boss was silent, his job was to let him remain silent. At the 18th minute, Tad reached down into the footwell beside the passenger seat and lifted a brown file folder. He passed it over his shoulder. He said nothing. August took it. A typed label was affixed to the cover, 4 words. Kovach, Paterick J. August didn't open it right away. He stared at the label for a long time, and his thumb came to rest over the letter J, and in his mind, that name had never existed until this exact second. Talk, 30 years old at the time of death. Accountant, licensed in the state of Illinois in 2019. Tad kept his eyes fixed through the windshield. 4 years at Meridian Ledger Group, August didn't move. That second name, he knew. He knew it very well. He knew its address, knew the floor, knew who signed, knew how much passed through it each month and how much merged clean on the other side. He had never set foot there in his life, and that was the entire point of its existence. Position? Not senior. Reconciliation of intermediary accounts. Level 4. Was his name on any list? No, his name never appeared anywhere. That was why they hired him. August opened the folder. The first page held a copy of an employee identification photograph. The man in the picture was thin, with brown hair and a blue tie, and he smiled at the camera like someone trying to smile exactly as the rules required. August studied the photograph longer than necessary. He thought of the polished elbows of a wool coat worn smooth from resting on a desk, and he didn't know why he thought of that, because he had never seen the coat. Date he left. Tad recited it without looking at the papers. Resignation submitted on September 12th. Effective immediately. He didn't give 2 weeks' notice. He walked out that morning and never returned. Reason listed? Personal reasons. Who approved it? No one. He didn't ask. He informed them. August turned the page. Date of death, October 3rd. Vehicle rollover on Archer Road at 11:17 at night. Single vehicle. No other car involved. The report says black ice on the roadway, 3 weeks. August counted it in his head, then counted it again, and the number didn't change. 21 days between a man rising from his desk inside one of August's companies and that same man's lying sideways in an overturned car. He closed the folder. He rested it on his lap. Beyond the glass, snow drifted through the streetlight, and a woman passed by pulling a shopping cart behind her, and she didn't look toward the black car parked in the shadows because in this neighborhood people didn't look. Tad, yes. When was this printed? Tad was silent for one beat. It was the first pause he had taken in the entire conversation. 4 months ago, August raised his head. He looked at the back of Tad's neck through the rearview mirror. 4 months, yes. And you're giving it to me tonight. Yes, why now? Tad didn't turn around. He kept both hands on the wheel and answered in the voice of a man who had prepared this sentence long ago and already understood its cost. Because until last week, you didn't care about her. No one spoke. The heater inside the car ran steadily. If I'd handed this to you 4 months ago, you would have glanced at the name, asked whether it affected the cash flow. I would have said no, and you would have told me to put it in the cabinet. I know because I've worked beside you for 20 years, and I know exactly which sentence you would have used. Tad stopped. Then last week, you walked into that diner. You walked through the door. So tonight I handed it to you. August sat motionless. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. He opened the folder again and turned to the final page, where a 1-page copy of the accident summary had been placed, and he read the first line 3 times. Black ice on the roadway, Archer Road, 11:17 at night, October 3rd. Tad, yes, Cudber, yes. In Chicago, Tad turned his head for the first time. The two men looked at one another through the darkness between the rows of seats. I need 3 things, August said. His voice was no louder than the heater. First, the original accident report, not the summary. Include the scene photographs. Second, the autopsy file, specifically the blood alcohol section and the seatbelt findings. He paused. Third, I want the GPS logs from the salt trucks. Department of Streets and Sanitation, the storm crew on duty that night, the entire Archer route beginning at 9 o'clock. Tad didn't blink. The third is a public record. We'll have to file under the Freedom of Information Act. The requester's name will appear. File it under the name of a lawyer no one knows works for me. It'll take 4 weeks. Then 4 weeks. August closed the folder, set it on the seat, and looked outside. 2 blocks away, the lights of Bellwether Kitchen were still glowing, a small golden point in the snow. What do you think is in there? Tad asked. August didn't answer. He only said, very softly, I think the night of October 3rd wasn't cold enough. It took 5 weeks, not 4. Tad handed over the second envelope on a Thursday night, in the same place, at the same corner, and this time he didn't wait for August to ask. Read page 3 first. August opened to page 3. It was a printout from the Chicago Department of Streets and Sanitation dispatch system. The storm crew on duty on the night of October 3rd. A data table. 1 column for time, 1 for coordinates, 1 for the status of the spreading equipment. Truck number 47. Archer route, the stretch from Pulaski Avenue to Kedzie Street. 10:37 at night. Status, spreading, speed, 20 miles per hour. Full route coverage. August read the line. Then he turned back to page 1 and read the line in the accident report. 11:17 at night, the same stretch of road. Black ice on the pavement. 40 minutes. 40 minutes between a salt truck passing through with full route coverage and a 4 Zoratan overturning on that exact stretch because of ice. The temperature that night, August said, 4 degrees Celsius above zero. 41 degrees Fahrenheit. No ice, no snow, light rain at 9, and it stopped odd before 10. Tad didn't look back. The salt truck that night was running a precautionary route under post-rain procedure. It wasn't necessary, but it ran. August turned to page 4. Crime scene photographs. He studied them for a long time. He didn't look at the car. He looked at the road around it, and the road was dry, gray, clean. But at the edge of the asphalt, there were heavy, fresh tire tracks cutting into the door shoulder, completely bypassing the dry road. Someone had intentionally forced Patrick's sedan off the pavement. Page 5, Tad said, the autopsy. Alcohol, none. Seatbelt, fastened. Injuries. One brief line concerning trauma to the neck that August read once and didn't read again. Page 6. Page 6 wasn't a public record. It consisted of 2 printed sheets from Meridian Ledger Group's internal system, and August knew immediately that Tad had paid dearly to obtain them. Access logs. On September 27th, from 10:20 at night until 1:40 in the morning, the Kovac P account accessed a chain of intermediary accounts 46 times, none of them included in his assigned reconciliation portfolio. The following morning, September 28th, he submitted his resignation. August read the balance transferred out of that chain over 11 months. $18,400,000. He read the name of the destination account. He read it 3 times. He didn't need to read it a 4th, but he did anyway. Then he folded the envelope closed and set it on the seat beside him. He said nothing. Tad said nothing. The heater steadily. Beyond the glass, a man walked past with a dog, turned at the corner and disappeared. The lights at Bellwether Kitchen went out at 11 o'clock, as they did every night. Then the counter lights went dark. Then a figure locked the door from the inside and left through the back entrance, and August watched until there was nothing left to watch. He didn't move. He didn't deke. Nothing inside the car broke. Nothing was struck. He simply sat with both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes open, while the clock on the dashboard changed from 11:23 to midnight, then to 1 o'clock. Tad didn't turn off the engine. Tad didn't look back. He had sat beside the man through 3 funerals and 1 gunshot wound, and he had never been as afraid as he was tonight, because during every one of those moments, the boss had said something, and tonight he said nothing at all. At 1:20, August finally spoke. His voice was normal. That was the worst part. I've never heard that name. I know. Not once in my life, I know. No one asked me. No one informed me. No one called me on the night of October 3rd. No, August looked outside at the darkened diner. That means it didn't need me, he said. It means someone could make a decision like that inside the house I built, and the house I built would continue running smoothly, and I would still drink my coffee in the morning. And I wouldn't know anything for 4 months. Tad didn't answer. There was no answer. I didn't give the order, August said. Yes, but I built the corridor it traveled through. I laid the floor. I installed the doors. Moved through that corridor. No one would ask questions. He paused. I didn't hold the knife. I built the table where they placed it. The clock changed to 1:21. Are you going to tell her? Tad asked. It was a question he wasn't permitted to ask, and he asked it anyway. August looked at the dark diner. I was going to let her finish burying her husband first. Tad sat motionless for 3 seconds. Then he spoke softly, without cruelty, only truth. She already buried him 4 months ago. The heater ran. Snow began to fall again, and August Falcone sat in the darkness of the car 2 blocks from the diner, staring toward the 3 concrete steps where his mother had died, and for the first time in 22 years, he understood that it was no sign the child outside at the door. He was the door that didn't open. He was waiting for her by the back entrance. 4 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, when Dell's shift ended, and when she pushed open the rear door to pour out the dirty mop water, he was standing there with his hands in his coat pockets, not leaning against the wall, simply standing. Delphine, she didn't pour out the basin. She remained in the doorway with it in her hands. I startled you. I'm sorry. If I came through the front, Ms. McQuillan would throw me out with her spatula. He smiled. She has her reasons. I don't blame her. What do you need? 5 minutes. He reached inside his coat and took out a craft envelope, unfolded and perfectly flat. You don't have to take it. You only need to look. He opened it right there beneath the yellow light of the back entrance, pulled out 3 sheets of paper, and held them at eye level for her. Dell recognized the first one immediately. For 4 months she had seen that logo on every envelope, every message, every call that came at 7 o'clock in the evening. Debt Recovery Fund. Account holder, Kovac, Delphine M. Balance, $61,400. The second page was a debt assignment agreement. The seller's signature belonged to Arthur Pell. The buyer was a company whose name she had never heard, and beneath it was the signature of a man whose hand she had shaken beside the sink 3 weeks earlier. The third sheet contained only 1 bold line, marked with a wet notarized seal and an embossed stamp. The debt has been paid in full. Remaining balance, 0. Date. Today. Dell said nothing. The basin of water was still in her hands, and it was heavy, and she didn't set it down, because setting it down would mean she intended to stay and talk. I bought it from Pell on Friday, he said. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. He sold it for less than I expected. Those funds lose more money the longer they hold a file, you know. You were a number on his Excel spreadsheet. He was happy to get rid of it. He folded the 3 sheets and held them out to her. It's finished. No one will call you tomorrow morning. There's nothing for you to sign. Nothing for you to repay. Dell looked at the envelope. $61,400. 34 stares every night. 4 voice messages a day. That voice reading each word slowly, like a man dictating to a child. She felt tears rising and hated herself for it, and she blinked them away. Why consider it a gift? No one gives some $61,000. People give each other more than you think. He smiled. My brother likes you. The basin tilted slightly in Dell's hands. Water spilled over the rim. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do. He was still smiling, and his voice was still warm. And that was what sent the chill down her spine that she had felt on the morning of the white tulips. He comes into the diner at 10:40 every day. He sits at the corner table. He repaired the heater with his bare hands, the same heater 4 repairmen wanted to replace. For 22 years, he never walked through that door, and then you gave him a bowl of soup, and he walked inside. He tilted his head. Delphine, I'm not angry with you. I'm pleased. He needed that. He held the envelope closer. I like the things he likes to be cared for properly. Dell looked at the envelope, and for exactly 2 seconds she almost took it. She felt her hand wanting to. She felt those 34 stairs in her calves, felt the baby inside her, felt the bottom drawer where Babs had hidden the $200 bills. Then she remembered what Babs had said. One day, you may need to give it back. And she understood, not through reason, through something beneath her breastbone. If she took this envelope, then everything she said from tomorrow onward would be the words of someone who had been paid $61,400. If one day she stood before anyone and said a single thing about her husband, about the company where he had worked, about anything at all, people would ask whether she had accepted money, and she would have to say yes, and the story would end there. This gift wasn't buying her silence. It was buying her right to speak. Dell set the basin on the step. She took the envelope, and she opened it, pulled out the 3 sheets and tore them in half, then into quarters. Her legs were trembling so badly that she had to lock her knees. She tore them a 3rd time, and the pieces bearing the embossed seal fell into the snow at his feet. Corwin didn't flinch. Corwin didn't frown. He looked down at the torn paper beneath his shoes for a long time, then raised his head and smiled. And this time his smile was really warm, warmer than when he had held the door for Sister Maureen. Your husband was just as stubborn, he said. He buttoned his coat. He wished her a good night. He walked to the mouth of the alley, turned the corner, and disappeared. Dell stood there in the back passage, the basin of water beside her feet, snow falling onto the scraps of paper, and inside her mind was nonsense circled again and again, growing loud with every turn. She had never told him she had a husband. The letters arrived on Thursday, not just one. The entire neighborhood received them at once. Benny pushed through the door at 7:10, just as he had every workday for 9 years, but this time he didn't sit down on his usual stool at the counter. He placed an envelope on the glass surface in front of Dell. Thick paper, embossed lettering, 3 words in the upper left corner, Harrogate Holdings. Read it, he said. Dell read it. The language was so polite that she had to read it twice before she understood what it was actually saying. The company was expressing interest in purchasing the property at the address listed above as part of a comprehensive urban redevelopment project for the Hoyne and Cermak area. The proposed price fell within the current market range. The letter made it clear that this wasn't a demand and that the recipient remained entirely free to decide. It thanked him for his many years of service to the community. At the bottom, a single line stood by itself. This offer remains valid until May 15th. How much? Dell asked. More than I thought the place was worth. Benny shrugged. That's the part that bothers me. By 8 o'clock, Mr. Alvarez had brought in his letter. At 8:20, the 2 electricians at table 7 said their landlords had received the same thing. By 9, the manager of the senior apartment building at number 22 Hoyne Street, a 4-story building with 41 units and an elevator that had been broken since the previous year, carried in a stack of letters and set them on the counter as though she were laying down a dead animal. 1 for every apartment. 41 letters. They had been addressed to each tenant, not to the building's owner. The word modernization appeared in every one. The letters stated that once construction was complete, current tenants would receive priority consideration to return. No one in the diner knew what priority consideration meant. At 9:30, Sister Maureen walked in carrying 2 empty plastic containers and an envelope made from the same thick paper. "All of St. Bridget," she said. Babs stood behind the counter without wiping anything, both hands tucked inside her apron. "What would they want with a charity kitchen?" "It sits on land," Sis Maureen said. "Once they buy the land, they can use it for anything they please." She placed the envelope on the counter. "Barbara, there's something else, say it. 3 weeks ago, 2 men came to the kitchen. They weren't from the city. Nice coats. They asked me about old things. When the kitchen first opened, who usually came? Whether the people around here were close to one another." She paused. "Then they asked whether I knew the diner on this corner. They asked how long you had been here. They asked whether you had any children or grandchildren." The heater hummed steadily. No one spoke. "I answered honestly," Sister Maureen said. "At the time, I didn't think I had anything to hide. 3 weeks ago," Babs said. 3 weeks ago. Dell looked down at the stack of letters on the counter. She looked at the date printed in the upper corner. Every letter had been printed on the same day. 3 weeks after 2 men in respectable coats had gone to ask a 71-year-old sister whether the people in this neighborhood were close to one another. "I'm not selling," Benny said. He spoke louder than necessary, addressing the entire diner rather than anyone in particular. "That shop belonged to my father. I changed the oil for half this neighborhood. I'm not selling. And how are you going to pay the ground rent when they buy everything around you?" Someone at table 7 asked. Benny didn't answer. It was a question no one could answer, and everyone knew it. By 10 o'clock, the diner was full, and no one ordered food. All 40 tables were occupied, and people simply held their letters and reread words they had already read 4 times. Some talked about the price. Some talked about interest rates. The apartment manager talked about how she had no idea where those 41 elderly residents were supposed to go within 3 weeks. Mr. Alvarez said he would call the ward alderman, and someone else said the alderman hadn't spoken a word since November, and the entire diner gave one brief, joyless laugh. People argued over whether they should sell. They argued over the price. They argued over whether the letter was a threat. And the people who said it wasn't won, because there wasn't a single threatening word anywhere in the letter, and that was what they used to reassure themselves. Dell stood behind the counter for 2 hours, pouring coffee and listening. It wasn't until the last person left at 11:30, when she turned the final chair upside down on the table, that she recognized Field had been crawling back along her spine all morning. The feeling she hadn't been able to name. 40 people, 2 hours. 41 letters sent to 41 elderly tenants. 1 letter sent to a charity kitchen. 1 to a repair shop, and 1 to this diner. Not one person in those 2 hours had asked who Harrogate Holdings was. Not because they were afraid to ask, because the thought had never entered anyone's mind. They argued about price, deadlines, and where they would go, as though the letter were weather, as though it had fallen from the sky and the only decision left to make was what kind of coat they should wear. Dell looked at the stack of thick paper on the counter. 3 weeks earlier, someone had gone around asking whether this neighborhood was close to one another, and she understood that it hadn't been a question. It had been a measurement. He waited for her at the clinic, not at the diner, not at her apartment, not by the back entrance. Dr. Sommer's obstetrics clinic on Ashland Avenue, Monday morning at 10:15, and when Dell stepped out of the ultrasound room with the image in her hand, a man was sitting in the waiting area reading a parenting magazine, and he stood when she passed. Miss Kovach, 46 years old. A coat that was neither expensive nor cheap. He held up his identification just long enough for her to see it, then put it away. Myron Latch, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chicago Field Office. "I know choosing this place isn't ideal," Ian said, and considered that. "No place would have been ideal. At least no one is watching you here. Who is watching me? That's what we need to discuss." They sat in a coffee shop half a block away. He bought her a cup of tea and never touched his own coffee. He didn't circle around the subject. That was the only decent thing Dell saw in him during the entire conversation. "Meridian Ledger Group," he said. "Your husband worked there for 4 years. Dell said nothing. "We've been investigating that company for 3 years. It isn't an accounting firm. It's a washing machine. Every month, dirty money goes in, clean money comes out. and your husband sat on the third floor reconciling it. He placed one hand on the table. On September 11th, he stayed until 14:40 in the morning and accessed a chain of accounts outside his assigned work 46 times. The next morning, he resigned. 3 weeks later, he died on Archer Road because of ice. He let the sentence remain between them, Miss Kovach. There was no ice in Chicago last October. Dell held the tea with both hands. She didn't drink. We can protect you. We have the United States Attorney's Office behind us. We have relocation funding, witness protection, everything. He lowered his voice. You're working in a place where August Falcone sits every morning at 10:40. You stand 13 feet away from him every day. No one else in the world has that position. What do you want me to do? Wear a recording device. 4 weeks. You don't have to ask him anything. You only have to be there and pour coffee the way you always do. He looked at her. Your husband died because of that organization, Miss Kovach. Do you want justice, or do you want to sit down and have dinner with it? Dell set down the tea. She thought of the ultrasound image in her coat pocket. She thought of the 34 stairs. She thought of a 30-year-old man wearing a seatbelt with no alcohol in his blood, lying sideways inside an overturned car on a dry stretch of road. And she asked him exactly one question. Do you know who killed my husband? Latch didn't hesitate. We believe it was Falcone. Dell looked at him. Which Falcone? Latch opened his mouth. He said nothing. Dell waited. She waited longer than necessary because she wanted to see it clearly, and she did. He didn't know. He didn't know how many people lived inside that house. He didn't know there was a younger brother who brought white tulips in the middle of February and remembered the names of everyone in a diner he had never visited before. He didn't know that $18,400,000 had moved out of a chain of accounts over 11 months. He had 3 years of files on a company, and he had a last name, and he needed that last name standing in front of a federal building with cameras pointed at it, and he didn't care which head the name belonged to. Miss Kovach. Distinguishing individuals within a criminal organization isn't. Do you know my husband's name? He fell silent. Patrick, she said. Patrick James Kovach, 30 years old. He rested his elbows on his desk so often that the fabric of his coats turned shiny. He kept 2 pens in his breast pocket and ruined the lining of 3 shirts. She stood. What did you call him in your files? A source? A subject? Or was he only the date, October 3rd? Miss Kovach, you'll use him as one line, Dell said. One line in an indictment. Something you can read in front of the cameras. And you'll leave. I'll still be here with my child in this neighborhood, and you won't remember his name 2 weeks later. She picked up the tea he had paid for and set it down in front of him. No, you're protecting him. I'm not protecting anyone. You haven't asked me a single question about my husband. You've asked me 4 questions about August Falcone, and none about Patrick. She put on her coat. You aren't looking for the person who killed my husband. You're looking for a last name. I won't let you borrow him to do that. She walked out. Latch didn't follow. He remained there and finished his cold coffee, and he wasn't a bad man, and that was the worst part. That night, Dell reached Hoyne Street at 11:20. A gray sedan was parked in front of her building. No license plates. Lights off. She walked past it, climbed the 34 stairs, and looked down through the window. It was still there at 1 o'clock. It was still there at 3. It was still there at 6:15 in the morning when she left for work. The windows covered in thick ice, the engine long since cold. No one got out. No one got in. All night long, not a single person stepped out of that car, and Dell understood that this was exactly what they wanted her to understand. Tad waited until August was inside the car before he spoke. This time, he didn't hand him an envelope. The name Harrogate, he said. I traced it to the parent company. Then to the parent company of that company. 4 layers. At the 4th layer, there was a signature. August looked through the window. Odessa. She created all 4 companies. In 10 months, using the same templates she has used for us for the past 20 years. The car moved along Cermak Road. Streetlights slid across the glass. There's more, Tad said. Last Tuesday. At 11 o'clock in the morning, she entered the federal building on Dearborn Street through the side entrance. She came out at 1:40. 3 hours, he paused. The man who met her at the door was an agent named Latch. August said nothing for 4 blocks. She's selling us to the FBI, Tad said, and she built Harrogate for Corwin at the same time. With the same pen? No, August said. She isn't selling twice. She's making one sale to 2 buyers with the same piece of merchandise. Tad fell silent. Corwin needs me to fall so he can rise. The FBI needs a head they can photograph. They both need exactly the same thing. She gives them my name, and she gets paid twice. He looked outside. She's still the best lawyer I've ever hired. Odessa Vantrick's office was on the 28th floor of a building on LaSalle Street, behind a wooden door with no nameplate, only a number. She was packing books into boxes when he entered. She didn't startle. She didn't stop working. You came in without knocking. Where are you moving? Boca Raton. She placed a volume of the Illinois compiled statutes inside a box. I've had enough the winters here. She was 52, her hair pinned neatly in place, and she was dressed for work even though she was packing, and August knew why. She was dressed for work because she had known he would come. Four companies, he said. 6, you only found 4. She didn't say it with arrogance, only precision. She closed the box and sealed it with tape. I expected you 2 weeks earlier. You're getting slow, August. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, empty-handed, his coat still on. Do you know what you've just done to that neighborhood? Odessa raised her eyes. For the first time. What neighborhood? 41 apartments. Elderly residents. There's an old woman on the 4th floor who can't get it downstairs because the elevator has been broken since August. A charity kitchen that gives out bread every Tuesday and Friday. An auto repair shop owned by a man who changes the oil for half that block. He paused. 41 letters, Odessa. You drafted that template. I drafted the language. I didn't send the letters. You know who did. I didn't ask. She pulled another box toward her. Do you know why I worked for your family for 20 years without ever asking questions? Because that was the job. I built structures. If the structure remained standing, I had done my work correctly. Who passed through it and what they did there wasn't my concern. You gave my name to Latch. Yes, she said it as flatly as though she were reading a clause. You're the head. You're what they were buying. I sold the most valuable item on the table. That is my entire profession, and you paid me very well to be good at it. Corwin killed a man. Odessa's hand stopped. For exactly 1 beat. Then she resumed packing. I wasn't aware of that. You are now. Now I'm packing. She sealed the second box slowly, keeping the tape perfectly straight. August, I worked for the family. I didn't work for a neighborhood. He didn't answer immediately. He stood there, and beyond the windows of the 28th floor, the city stretched gray and white all the way to the lake. He thought of himself 10 years earlier. He knew exactly what that man would have done inside this room. That man wouldn't have said a single word. That man would have left Tad behind, and by tomorrow morning, Miss Vantrick wouldn't have boarded a plane to Boca Raton. And no one would have asked why, because no one ever asked questions inside the couture he had built. He knew that feeling. He knew how easy it was. He fastened the button on his coat. You're right, he said. That is why you lose. Odessa looked up. This time she studied him longer. Excuse me? You built structures for 20 years, and you never asked who passed through them. So you never knew what was moving through them. He walked toward the door. Those 41 letters are sitting on a counter at the corner of Hoyne Street and Cermak Road, Odessa. In the same place. On the same morning. You sent them to 41 different people, and you didn't know that all 41 of those people eat breakfast at the same diner. He opened the door. You're good with paper. You've never been good with people. He walked out. He didn't slam the door. He didn't close it gently. He simply left and allowed it to remain open. And that was the only thing that evening that made Odessa Vantrick stop working, sit on the edge of her desk, and stare at the open doorway for a very long time. Inside the car, Tad didn't ask. He only looked into the mirror. Hallie Vance, August said. Who? The Tribune. She wrote about the displacement cases in Pilsen last year. He looked through the window. Give her number to Miss Quillen. Not to me, to Miss Quillen? If I call, it becomes my story. If she calls, it becomes theirs. The car turned onto Hoyne Street, and people only believe a story when it belongs to them. Babs made the call on Friday afternoon, and Hallie Vance arrived at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, and Babs didn't meet her at the front door. She led her straight into the kitchen. Hallie was 31 years old, wearing a cheap coat and snow boots, carrying a notebook and a small recorder that she placed on the steel table between a pot of simmering bean soup and a tray of bread that hadn't yet gone into the oven. I need to make 3 things clear, Hallie said. First, I don't pay sources. Second, I don't publish anything I can't hold in my own hands. Third, if I write this story, your names will appear in it. Anyone who can't live with that should leave now. No one left. Babs placed a hard-bound ledger on the table. its cloth spine worn away at one corner. 40 years, what's in it? Everything. I wrote down food costs, rent, repairs. I wrote down the day the heater first broke. I wrote down the name of every repairman who came in and gave me an estimate. She opened it to the final page and laid the Harrogate letter on top. The date printed on this letter is February 11th, Hallie wrote it down, and the date I recorded those two strangers questioning Maureen was January 20th. Sister Maureen pushed forward another ledger, thinner than Babs's and ruled in squares. I record everyone who comes into the kitchen. I have for 40 years. Their name, the time, what they need. She opened the exact page. January 20th, 2 men. They didn't eat. They didn't ask for anything. They asked me 11 questions. I wrote down all 11 because I found them strange. Hallie read them, then she read them again. She looked up. Question number 9. Did you write this word for word? Word for word, Hallie read aloud. Do people in this neighborhood tend to gather in one particular place? She set down her pen. Benny came in at 7:20. He didn't remove his coat. He placed a yellow carbon copy on the steel table, the kind of 3-part form every repair shop in Chicago had used since his father was alive. September 30th, he said. His voice didn't sound like his own. Kovach, Patrick, 4-door sedan. He came in saying the brakes sounded strange. Dell stood with her back against the refrigerator. She hadn't known. She had never known. I removed all 4 wheels. I replaced the front pads even though they weren't worn out, because he said he needed to be certain. I bled the brakes, changed the brake fluid, and inspected every line. Benny tapped one finger against the yellow page. I wrote this at the bottom, in my handwriting, on September 30th. Braking system in perfect condition. Front pads replaced at customer's request. He raised his eyes. 3 days later, he died after losing control on Archer Road. No one spoke. The bean soup bubbled quietly. I've kept the yellow copy for every car I've touched for 9 years, Benny said. My father taught me that. He said one day, some bastard would accuse me of doing careless work. He looked at Dell. I didn't know that day would look like this. Dr. Ingrid Summer arrived at 8:10. She was 36 years old and had come directly from her shift, her hospital identification card still hanging around her neck. She placed a thin file on the table. I need Miss Kovach's permission first, Dell nodded. 4 months ago, my patient was hospitalized for 3 nights. The bill was $61,400. She had no insurance. She turned over 1 page. I submitted an application for financial assistance under Illinois state law. It was denied. I submitted it a 2nd time. Denied again. The 3rd time, I called the finance department directly, and they told me the account no longer belonged to the hospital. It had been sold. She laid down the page. The date was the buyer was a debt recovery fund. She placed a 2nd sheet beside it. On February 28th, that fund sold it again to a company. I searched the company's name because I was curious. Hallie picked up the page. She read it. She looked at Dell. Harrogate Holdings. Dell heard herself breathing. She remembered the back entrance. She remembered the pieces of paper, with the embossed seal falling into the snow. He had already held her debt in his hands before he stood there waiting for her. He hadn't bought it to give her a gift. He had bought it the same day he began buying the entire block. She had only been another address on the list. Hallie Vance switched off the recorder. Then she switched it back on. Then she placed both hands on the table and looked around the kitchen. At the 68-year-old woman with a 40-year ledger. At the 71-year-old sister with 11 questions, recorded word for word. At the mechanic holding a yellow carbon copy. At the doctor still wearing her hospital badge. I'm going to ask all of you one question, she said. Then I'll decide whether I'm writing this story. She looked at each of them in turn. In those 41 letters, during the past 3 weeks, did anyone explain who's behind that company? Babs said, no. Sister Maureen said no. Benny said no. Dr. Sommer said no. Hallie turned toward Dell. Dell stood against the refrigerator with both hands around her belly, and she spoke the sentence she would remember for the rest of her life. No. And what's worse, Miss Vance, she raised her head. Not one of us thought to ask. That's what they were counting on. Hallie Vance looked at her for a long time. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and began writing very quickly. And outside, beyond the kitchen door, no one noticed that a man had been standing just beyond the threshold for 40 minutes. Never stepping inside, never speaking. Only listening. Benny saw him first. He rose from his chair without saying anything, simply stood, and everyone in the kitchen turned in the direction of his gaze. August Falcone stood outside the kitchen doorway. Melted snow darkened the shoulders of his coat. He didn't step inside. Behind him, in the narrow hallway, Thaddeus Reese stood about 6.5 feet away, holding a black leather briefcase. Hallie Vance reached toward the recorder to switch it off. "Don't," August said. "Let it keep running. No one invited him in, no one said anything." Babs rested the ladle against the rim of the bean soup pot and wiped her hands on her apron very slowly, then walked around the steel table and stopped across from him, exactly 1 step from the threshold. The two of them looked at each other, 40 years and 22 years. "What are you standing there for?" she asked. "You know what I'm standing here for, yeah?" "I know," she didn't move aside. "You want to sit with us?" "I'm not asking for a seat, then what do you want?" August was silent. Babs pointed toward the steel table, toward the 40-year ledger, the yellow carbon copy, Dr. Zummer's file, and the ruled notebook containing 11 questions recorded word for word. "There's nobody important at that table. There's no boss here. There's an old woman who makes soup, a sister who gives out bread, a man who changes oil, a doctor who works nights, and a girl who is 6 months pregnant." She looked directly at him. "You want to come inside? Leave your name at the door. In here, there are only people." No one breathed. August looked down at the threshold. The smooth aluminum strip beneath his feet stood about 3/4 of an inch high, worn into a shallow groove at the center by 40 years of shoes passing over it. He stared at it longer than an ordinary man would stare at a doorway. Then he stepped across. Nothing happened. There was no thunder. The heater continued to hum. The soup continued to simmer. He simply stepped into a kitchen and stood there. And Babs turned her back, returned to the pot, and said nothing else, and that was the entire ceremony. Tad stepped forward. He placed the leather briefcase on the steel table, opened the locks, and removed a thick stack of papers. And before he released them, he spoke quietly, just loud enough for August to hear. "You put this on the table, you lose everything." August didn't look at him. "I know. Corwin isn't connected to all of it. This chain runs through 4 of our companies. Miss Vance publishes it, and the entire structure is exposed. 11 years. All of it, I know. You'll go to prison." August placed one on the papers instrument pushing the center of the steel table, beside the pot of bean soup, beside the cloth-bound ledger, beside the yellow carbon copy. "I lost everything when I was 15, he said. He didn't speak loudly. He said it the way a man reads a line of figures. "Everything I had afterward was only something I bought so I wouldn't have to remember." Hallie Vance picked up the papers. She turned the first page. Then she began flipping through them quickly, and the color drained from her face. "What is this?" "Transfer logs. The chain of intermediary accounts, 11 months. Originals with transaction codes and the names of the people who approved them." He recited the details in an even voice. $18,400,000 moved out of the common fund. The destination account has 6 layers. The final layer belongs to a company registered in Delaware. The woman who signed the formation documents was Odessa Vantricht. He paused. "The ultimate beneficiary is my younger brother." The ladle in Babs's hand stopped in the middle of the pot. Dell looked at the documents, remembering the empty soup bowl sitting on the shelf. "You're going to ask why I have these," August said. "Because it was my money. It was taken from my structure through doors I installed." He looked at Hallie. "You publish this, you get Corwin. You also get me. I'm not asking you to remove any part of it." Hallie set the papers down. She was the first to ask the question everyone else was thinking. "Mr. Falcone? Why?" August didn't answer her. He turned. Dell was still standing where she had been, leaning against the refrigerator with both hands around her belly. She hadn't spoken a word since he crossed the threshold. "On September 27th, your husband stayed until 1:40 in the morning," he said. "He accessed a chain of accounts outside his assigned work 46 times. The next morning, he resigned. The entire kitchen was silent. On October 3rd, his car overturned on Archer Road. The initial report claimed he lost control on dry pavement, but the scene photographs tell a different story. Corwin's men forced him off the road in the dark. He looked directly at her. I didn't give the order. I had never heard his name until 3 weeks ago, and that isn't an excuse. It's an indictment. Someone did it inside my house, and I knew nothing because I built that house precisely so no one would ever have to ask me." He paused. "My husband died because I laid the floor of that corridor." No one spoke. Dell looked at him. She had allowed him to finish. She had stood there and let every word fall, and only then did she speak, and her voice was perfectly ordinary, and that was what made the entire kitchen turn cold. I already know. August didn't move. I've known since last night. She stepped away from the refrigerator, walked 3 paces, and placed a yellow carbon copy on the steel table. September 30th. Benny replaced his brake pads. Patrick came to him because he was afraid. She looked down at the simmering pot of bean soup. My husband knew 3 days before he died, 11 o'clock at night. The sign had been hung. Babs hadn't gone home. Holly Vance was still sitting at the steel table with the stack of papers. Dell was turning the chairs upside down. The bell over the door gave a sudden, ominous rattle. Corwin walked in alone. No car, no one waiting outside. He removed his scarf and draped it over the back of a chair like a man entering his own home. He carried nothing. His hands were empty. That was the most frightening thing, and all 5 people inside the diner understood it immediately. He didn't need to bring anything, Miss Quillen. I'm sorry it's so late, he smiled. Brother, August stood. Sit down, Corwin said. I only have 3 things to say. He took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from inside his coat and placed it on the counter. Transfer of operational control. Everything. You sign it. You keep all your personal assets. You move to Palm Beach. And you never have to hear my name again. He tapped the paper twice with one finger lightly. Second, Miss Vance, you go home and you have nothing. You're holding stolen documents, and you know it. Hallie didn't move. Third, he turned toward Dell. He didn't threaten her. His voice didn't change. He smiled, and his voice was as warm as it had been on the morning of the white tulips. Delphine. 34 stairs, number 42 Hoyne Street. No elevator. Ashland Avenue for your prenatal appointments. 6:15 every morning. Walking to the number 9 bus stop, he tilted his head. It would be very sad for one family to suffer 2 traffic accidents. No one breathed. You have 10 seconds, Corwin said. Then Tad Reese stepped out of the kitchen. He walked past August. He didn't look at August. He went directly to Corwin and stood at his right side facing the room, both hands hanging loose. Babs made a very small sound. Dell felt the floor tilt beneath her. 3 years, Corwin said. You didn't know, did you? He smiled, and this time the smile was so genuine that it made them sick. For 3 years he sat in the car with you, and for 3 years he called me every Tuesday night. Tad reached into his coat pocket. He took out a phone. He didn't hand it to Corwin. He handed it to Hallie Vance. 412 files, Tad said. 3 years. Dates, times, numbers. It includes the call from the night of October 2nd, 11:40 at night, 3 minutes and 16 seconds. Corwin stopped smiling. File number 397, Tad said. Play that one, Miss Vance. Corwin turned toward August, and for those 2 seconds, for the first time in her life, Dell saw the true face of the man who had brought white tulips, and it resembled nothing at all. It was empty, like a room no one had ever lived in. You knew? Corwin said. August didn't rise. I haven't trusted you since you were 10 years old, he said. I was only waiting for you to prove me right. Hallie pressed the button. Corwin's voice came from the small speaker, distorted and distant, but unmistakable. October 2nd, 11:40 at night. He said the name of the road. He said the name of a man. He made one brief remark about what the weather was supposed to be like the following night, and said that some things didn't need to be complicated. Then he laughed in the recording, and that laugh was something Dell would hear inside her mind for many years. The diner was silent. There was only the sound from the small speaker. Then the doors opened. There was no shouting, no door being kicked in. 6 people in coats simply entered through the front door and 4 more through the back, with Myron Latch walking between them, his hands empty, and he spoke only one sentence. Corwin Falcone. Corwin didn't run. He stared for a long time at the small speaker in Hallie Vance's hand, then held out both hands, and they led him toward the door. And as he passed Dell, he turned his head and looked at her without saying a word, and that was the last time she ever saw his face. Odessa Vantricht was arrested at 11:50 at O'Hare Airport. At the gate for a flight to Miami, her boxes of books already checked. Then Latch turned back. He looked at August. August had risen at some point. He removed his coat, folded it, and placed it over the back of a chair. He walked around the counter. Before Latch could reach behind his back, August held out both wrists as in front of him pressed together, palms turned upward. Mr. Falcone, I know, August said. Do it. Babs turned her face toward the wall. Sister Maureen made the sign of the cross. Benny stood and didn't know what to do with his hands. They led August toward the door. Dell ran after him. She reached the steps as snow was falling, and she had time for only one sentence. August, he stopped. He turned his head, only his head. You knew it would end this way, she said. Yes, since when? Since I told Tad to give Miss Vance's number to Miss Quillen. Snow fell across Dell's face. She didn't wipe it away. Then why did you still walk inside? August looked at her. Then he looked past her shoulder, through the glass, into the brightly lit diner, toward table number 1 beside the heater. Because you said I didn't have to sit outside tonight, he said. Then they put him in the car. The federal trial opened in June. And what silenced the entire courtroom wasn't the $18,400,000. It was an envelope. Sister Maureen Flannery, 71 years old, stepped onto the witness stand and placed it in front of the prosecutor. Ordinary paper, yellowed around the edges. On it was the handwriting of a 30-year-old man. Open only up leads edit. He gave it to me with his volunteer application, Sister Maureen said. October 1st. He told me he wanted to hand out bread on Tuesdays and Fridays. He never had the chance to attend even once. They asked why she had kept it for 7 months. Because it said to open it only if she needed it, she said. For the past 7 months, she didn't. Last week, she did. Inside the envelope were copies of the access logs, transaction codes, and the name of the destination account, enough to seal every opening the defense attorneys had intended to pry apart. At the bottom, folded separately, was a sheet of paper that had nothing to do with the case. Dell didn't open it in the courtroom. She carried it back to Bellwether, went into the employee changing room, a space smaller than 43 square feet, with 3 metal lockers and 1 plastic chair, and she didn't sit on the chair. She lowered herself to the floor, rested her back against the lockers, and opened it. 3 sentences. I left my job because our child is about to be born. I don't want our baby growing up on that money. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home in time. But you need to know that I tried to become a decent man before I became a father. Dell sat on the changing room floor for a very long time. Babs didn't come inside. She stood outside the door for 20 minutes without knocking, and it was the kindest thing she had ever done for anyone. For 4 months, Dell had been angry with him because of 11 days of silence. During those 3 weeks, he hadn't explained, and now she understood why he couldn't. He hadn't gone looking for justice. He simply hadn't wanted his child to grow up on that money, and he died for that one thing. August Falcone pleaded guilty to conspiracy under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. There was no murder charge. Full cooperation, 412 recordings, 11 years of records, 4 years in federal prison. They offered him witness protection, a new name, a new life. He refused. He said he'd spent his entire life living beneath a name he hadn't chosen, and he wouldn't run from the name he had stained with his own hands. Corwin Falcone received a life sentence. Odessa Vantrick received 4.5 years for obstruction of justice. Harrogate Holdings collapsed before 3rd installment of Hallie Vance's article was published, and the city council canceled the entire Hoyne and Cermak redevelopment plan. In August, all 41 elderly residents remained in their homes. The elevator was repaired in September. Dell gave birth in May, a little girl. On the birth certificate, she wrote Giovanna Kovac, the last name of her father, the man who had tried to become decent before becoming a father, and the first name of the woman who had died exactly 3 steps from an open door. That autumn, Babs opened the vacant unit in Stagor, the one that had stood empty for 12 years. It wasn't a second diner. It was a community kitchen, no charge. Open 24 hours on every night the temperature fell below 10 degrees. She called it the threshold. There was only 1 sentence on the wall, painted by hand, without a frame. No one sits outside. 5 years later, on February 14th, snow was falling. Dell was 32, standing side by side table number 1 near the heater that had continued running smoothly since that day and hadn't broken once. She set down 2 sets of silverware, folded 2 napkins. 4-year-old Giovanna Kovac stood at the window counting snowflakes and couldn't count beyond 12. Mommy, who's coming? Someone we know who sits outside. Across the street, the lights were still on inside Benny's repair shop, and a 46-year-old man named Thaddeus stood there wiping his hands on a rag, a man who had spent 217 hours in interview rooms and hadn't demanded a single cent. The bell over the door rang. No, not. Yet footsteps crunched across the salt, then stopped. A man stood on the steps. His coat wasn't expensive, his shoes were cheap. He stopped in that exact place, obeying the reflex of 27 years, and he didn't step forward. Dell went to open the door. Snow blew inside. She looked at him and spoke the words she had said to him in the snow 5 years earlier, and her voice didn't tremble. "You aren't alone tonight." August Falcone looked down at the threshold beneath his feet, then he stepped across it. Giovanna ran toward him, handed him a spoon and looked up. "Babs says anyone who comes inside has to carry his own tray." August took the spoon. He looked at the little girl for a long time. Then he smiled sincerely. For the first time in his life, and 73-year-old Babs stood in the kitchen watching him, and she had to turn her face away. Outside, snow continued falling across the steps where a woman had died because no one opened a door. Inside, the jam remains on. The table was set for two, and this time both chairs had someone sitting in them. This story leaves us with something very simple. No one dies because of snow. People die because an entire street decides at the same moment that what is happening isn't their concern. Babs spent 40 years trying to redeem 20 minutes of hesitation, and the lesson isn't that she was guilty. The lesson is never to let yourself pay a price like that. Kindness that arrives late is still kindness, but it will always cost more than kindness offered at the right moment. Delphine had nothing. She owed $61,000. She was 6 months pregnant. She was a widow. But she had a bowl of soup, and she refused to walk past another human being as though she couldn't see him. That was the one thing money couldn't buy, not even the money of a man who could purchase an entire neighborhood. Respecting another human being isn't knowing who they are. It is treating them with kindness before you know who they are. As for August, he still had to spend 4 years in prison, and that was right. People have the right to change, but no one has the right to escape the consequences. True debt redemption isn't being acquitted. It is standing up and holding out both hands before someone has to force you to do it. And what about you? Have you ever walked past someone, sitting outside in the cold, and told yourself it wasn't your concern? Have you ever been the person knocking on the door, or the person standing behind the curtain and watching? Share your thoughts in the comments. We truly want to hear the deepest feelings in your hearts. If this story touched you, please press the like button. Share it with someone who may need to hear it tonight, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to meaningful stories together every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.